We run FDR. Run FDR, it's a public park.
When I first started working on this video, the last thing I expected to find was the wildest Tony Hawk game I've ever played. It has the most jarring aesthetic I've seen in the series, it's surprisingly fun, and it's not even originally the game I was making this video for. If you grew up with the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series like me, you're familiar with the Quadrilogy and some of the later spin-offs. You're probably also familiar with the EA Skate series, a realistic take on skateboarding games that was a breath of fresh air coming from the heavily arcade-focused gameplay of Pro Skater. Anytime I think of EA Skate, I'm reminded of the very unfortunate downfall of the Tony Hawk games. Tony Hawk Ride was a weird spin-off that you played with a plastic skateboard, an idea that probably shouldn't have left the R&D phase. Pro Skater HD was a crapshoot remake, and Pro Skater 5 was a middle finger to any audience still waiting around for a new skateboarding game. These were later games developed by studio Robomoto, who took over after Activision kicked Neversoft to the curb. Or at least that's my assumption. Fact check me in the comments if I'm wrong about that. Of course, in recent years, Vicarious Visions brought us a banger of a remake and were rewarded with their talent being absorbed into Activision Blizzard and having their studio shut down. But every time I think of the weird twists and turns that the series took in the later years, I think about those later games that I never got around to giving a chance. When I was glued to my OG Xbox as a kid, I spent countless hours playing Pro Skater 4 and American Wasteland, but by the time I got a PS3, I was too busy playing COD to give those later games a chance. If I did find myself playing a skateboarding game, it was when I hopped on my friend's copy of EA Skate, which admittedly made me forget that any other games were an option. Well, I was reminded when I saw how bad Tony Hawk Ride looked, but outside of that, I had just kind of completely given up on the series. But the choice of not keeping up with the series has always left me with this burning question. What was Neversoft doing to keep up with EA Skate at the time? Were there any games worth rekindling my love of the series over, or was the decline of the series the most obvious reason to stay away from it? These would be the questions leading me in to look into what I missed. And what I missed was potentially the most interesting time to be a Tony Hawk game fan.
Say, champ, I've got a keen notion. My balls are flying everywhere. How about you shag 'em for me?
The last Tony Hawk game I played was American Wasteland, but if we fast forward to the very next year, the next main game we would get would be, not this one. Yeah, within a year we got two Tony Hawk games, one being shovelware tier garbage, but the other one being a little more interesting. While the other one was a little bit more of a spin-off by a different studio, this next game would be the next main game from Neversoft. Project 8.
I'm putting together an amazing new skate team. The best 8 skaters that can out-rip, out-shred, and outdo all the others will be the lucky few who make it onto my new venture.
Project 8 attempts to bring the series into the next generation, sporting a new engine, new physics system, and a seamless open world. Unlike the hidden loading tunnels in American Wasteland, you can directly go to any area that you see without a loading screen. Areas of the world are unlocked as you progress through the story, which Project 8 brings you through your own custom character. You were one of the hundreds competing to get into the top 8 spots for a team being put together by Tony Hawk himself, the Project 8.
Project 8.
Look, I didn't say the story was anything innovative here. The visuals will be a little bit subjective here, as you can probably tell, because the characters definitely have an interesting look to them when you first start the campaign creation. One of the things that I immediately noticed when starting the game was that new engine that they were flexing. If you're used to the classic games, you'll immediately notice everything from small details like clothing physics all the way to ragdoll physics that completely leave your character comically bailing out of control. And it's not just a new engine that's been added here. There's a new gameplay feature known as Nail the Trick, a freestyle slow-mo trick where you flick your analog sticks to chain classic flips into your own move. Flicking your analog sticks to do tricks, does that sound a little familiar? This is actually the feature that kept Project 8 baked into the back of my memory for all of these years, despite the fact I had never played it. The thing is, I always assumed that Nail the Trick was just a knockoff feature attempting to cash in on the popularity of EA Skate. And I felt like my thoughts were being confirmed here when I actually started to play the game, and I saw not only this, but I also saw new ragdoll challenges. I assume that these new ragdoll challenges where you intentionally hurt yourself crashing through checkpoints or racking up a hospital bill were inspired by EA Skate's Hall of Meat game mode, until I realized the EA Skate was released almost a year after Project 8. It really makes you wonder who was taking inspiration from who here. But if we take a look back at Project 8, there's a lot more here to talk about than stolen valor. That sticky but simple complex gameplay loop that the Tony Hawk games are known for is back here in full swing. After not playing a Tony Hawk game for years, I felt right at home getting back into that addicting gameplay loop that Project 8 offers. Racking up combos and seeing how far I can take them, or finding the best line in an area is still as fun as ever, and the gameplay rewards you for it. Your currency in the game used for new gear is earned by pulling off tricks around crowds sprinkled throughout the city. You can use these new tokens on gear, or you can just ignore them and keep playing the game to level up. This time around, your stats are increased based on how much of that stat you're actually using, which is a great incentive to keep grinding in between missions. And this exploration is made even more fun by these dynamic crowds that react to you while you're skating, missions that you can drop in and out of whenever you want, and a world that's free to explore as you see fit. The gameplay loops come together in a neat package that encourages you to keep playing, and this isn't even mentioning the sensory overload of the game constantly throwing new things at you to do.
See this on the top of your screen? That's the compass.
Whether it's pulling off a show with a pro skater that you run into, or doing lines in front of a guy shooting your skate video, the amount of challenges littered across the map would give Ubisoft a run for their money. And this is on top of the classic 2-minute challenges that you can complete for each area, just like the old games. Clearly, Neversoft didn't forget what makes a good Tony Hawk game here, and the passion is clear not only throughout the gameplay, but through the love given to the featured skaters and the sport itself. A lot of people may not have been a fan of the new features or design choices, but from what I've played, the game holds its own against the best in the series in my opinion. That being said, the move to the next generation hasn't come without its growing pains. For starters, the performance drop is definitely noticeable. We got the graphics up, but we also got the frame rate down. My PS3 is already fighting for its life with its thermals, but the game struggles to maintain 30 FPS regardless, and that's already half the frame rate of what previous games ran on older hardware. The lower frame rate wouldn't necessarily be bad on its own, but the problem is that it leaves little headroom for all of the new visual details that Project 8 has to offer. Moving through certain stretches of area during challenges, or the picture-in-picture effect in particular, seems to get pretty taxing on the poor console. If you played Project 8 yourself and you're unfamiliar with these new technical features or performance issues, it's probably because you were playing a different version of the game.
Seems like the colored ribs on his pool cover are the only things keeping him from rolling back.
See, up to this point, I've been talking about the PS3 and 360 versions of Project 8, but that's not the whole story here. Impressively, Project 8 got ports to a lot more platforms than just the 360 and PS3, including the PSP. It seems pretty wild that they were able to cram such an ambitious game on a handheld at the time. I mean, hell, even the Need for Speed titles weren't able to get more than their own spin-offs from their console counterparts. Well, it turns out there's actually a reason for that. Unlike American Wasteland, which was arguably the same experience across new and old consoles, Project 8 would be a significantly different experience on older hardware. For starters, the last-gen version seems to use the old engine from American Wasteland. This means no ragdoll physics, a segmented level system, and a fairly different mission structure in some areas. Obviously, the graphics take a pretty big hit, and the game feels significantly less alive as a result. There's no crowds of NPCs walking around, levels feel smaller and less detailed, and missions seem significantly easier and less thought out in general. For example, the mission that leads you into the big city has a gate that you open by sketching an RC car being driven around the cul-de-sac. In the next-gen version, this RC car will already be racing around the map, but in the last-gen versions, you have to activate this mission manually. All of the missions and scene events that were previously rendered in real time are now cutscenes, by the way. Once you knock open the gate, it's still obviously shut in the last-gen version. I didn't play too much of the last-gen versions, but from what I played, it feels like a clearly compromised experience, and I don't really like it. I can easily see why this may have turned off people that played it back in the day. It's almost a completely different game as a result of the cut content, and not really a good one at that. But with the last-gen version aside, I really do believe that they were onto something special with Project 8. Now, it definitely has its quirks, but it's a fun experience that attempts to improve the classic formula. And that's honestly where I thought I'd be leaving this video. We covered the game where you flick your analog sticks just like EA Skate. It came out around the same time. That was until I realized that there was a game after Project 8. And that's where things really start to get interesting. Tony Hawk's Proving Ground would follow just a year later, and considering that this was far beyond the time I was paying attention to the series, I completely forgot that this existed. I knew about this game by name, and that was about it. What I didn't know about was the wild ass aesthetic that this game game takes on in the beginning. Proving Ground starts off like a lot of previous games. You make your skater with various customization options. Unless it's a female one, I decided to make mine the Hulk, and then you're introduced into the world you'll be rising up the ranks in. The one place I wasn't expecting to start my Tony Hawk campaign off in is one of the most dilapidated cities I've ever seen in a video game.
What a dump.
You start your campaign off in inner city Philly, and if you Google that, it definitely doesn't give you a good representation of the area you're playing in Proving Grounds.
Hey man, East Coast, you gotta love it.
Which the same could probably be said if you Googled my city or your city, so it's realistic. Proving Grounds starts you off in inner city Philly, a rundown area with condemned houses and homeless people littering the trash-filled streets. The early missions have you learning how to chain together moves outside of liquor stores and how to rig up ramps over abandoned cars on bricks. This is not what I was doing in Project 8. Proving Ground takes place in multiple areas in Philly, Baltimore, Washington, and like the previous game, it's all linked together in a seamless open world. After the initial shock of the first level's design, the second thing I noticed was how much more alive this area felt compared to Project 8. People are waiting for the trains that are bustling across the overhead tracks, cars are honking at homeless people in the streets. Sponsored by Jeep, and there's crowds of spectators and other skaters that'll react to your movement. There's also more detail in the world as a whole, and overall, it feels like the most realistic setting that I've seen in a Tony Hawk game. I even noticed a setting to turn on realistic physics in the settings, which locks down the gravity to what you would experience if you were actually skating, and it honestly seems to work better than you'd expect. All of the new areas here make for one big playground that seamlessly lends itself to all your gameplay choices, which is where things get even more interesting in Proving Grounds. I just realized that I think I've been calling Proving Grounds this whole time. The interesting element that really stands out in Proving Ground is its focus on multiple story paths. Proving Ground attempts to push the envelope a little bit in its storytelling and not shy away from the sketchier parts of skating in a big city. This includes multiple story paths that not only explore these themes a little bit further, but bring new abilities to the player as they progress through the game. You have your career path that focuses specifically on you rising the ranks as a professional, a hardcore path that teaches you how to push your character to their limits and break down any barriers in their way, and a rigor path that teaches the player how to get creative with their limitations. Sure, some of the themes may be a little more surface level than others, and the different paths kind of end up bleeding together regardless, but by and large, this is probably the most invested I've ever been in a story in a Tony Hawk game. Its approach is grounded in a way that makes every interaction you have with a new character or pro skater feel realistic. The story on its own is enough to keep things interesting, but Proving Grounds takes it a step further by introducing new gameplay elements through these story arcs. The rigor storyline is all about building your own skate tools to turn everyday areas into your own skate spot. Proving Ground basically takes the create a park feature from previous games and allows you to do it wherever you want. If you want to place rails and quarter pipes in the middle of the street blocking traffic, you can do that. And you'll learn these crafting items and skills from playing the rigor storyline, feeding you challenges that'll force you to get creative and learn how the tools work.
It's never a good idea to mess with another man's tools.
To go along with these tools, you also have your own skate lounge. This is a spot that you can essentially use as your own custom park, and it includes pieces that you've collected throughout the mainline story. Kind of like the park that you were building in American Wasteland. Supposedly this was an area you could also invite your friends that you were playing online with to come check out, and everybody's would be a little bit different. It's a really interesting way to mix up the original create a park feature where you kind of just create a park wherever you are in the world. The hardcore story is where you'll learn new abilities to take advantage of in Proving Ground, like the aggro kick that allows you to catch more speed, or the skate check that allows you to knock every civilian you come across into the stratosphere, as well as gang members. Yeah, there's gangs in this Tony Hawk game.
This is our spot, homie. We run FDR. Run FDR? It's a public park. Yo, what the hell?
All of these features feed into one another, and it makes exploring every storyline essential to the progression. And that's not even mentioning new features like the video editor, which essentially allows you to shoot and edit your own skate videos within the game. You can set up custom camera angles, trim your clips together, and apply different filters and effects that you can buy with the money you earn in the game. It's a surprisingly robust feature considering that content sharing and montages weren't really a thing at the time, and it really plays well into the immersive freedom you have to create your own fun. Despite all of these new additions, Proving Ground seems to run even smoother than Project 8, while also adding many gameplay additions and refinements. Ragdoll physics are more realistic this time around and make me feel a little guilty for the abuse that I put this guy through. Although just ragdolling my character throughout the map could be its own game mode. Nail the Trick feels more accurate this time around, and it includes grabs. The world feels more alive and fun to explore. There's an eye-watering amount of content that'll keep you busy. And that's not even mentioning features like the classic arcade machines that let you do classic challenges with the pro skaters, or the multiplayer offerings that launched with the game. This came out in 2007, by the way, just 2 years into the console generation at that time. Now, what were we getting 2 years into the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles launch? But just like the previous entries, you didn't need a next-gen console to get in on Proving Ground. The PS2 and Wii would receive their own console variations. Strangely enough, there was no OG Xbox port this time around, which is probably why I didn't get into this game. It's probably for the best that I didn't experience this version of the game. Once again, the PS2 and Wii versions are running on the old engine. This of course means no real-time cutscenes, no ragdolls or realistic control options, no video editor feature, and no open world. It was pretty interesting to see the rig feature carried over in this version of the game, but considering the scope of Proving Ground, there's no telling how much content was cut from this version. It's also just not a very good looking version of the game by comparison. For what it's worth, I'm sure the story is still intact here, but in my opinion, you'd be much better off playing any of the older titles that were actually catered to that platform. But I didn't really give this version of the game too much time, so if it's something that you're familiar with, be sure to let me know your experience of the last gen. Proving Ground would ultimately be Neversoft's last Tony Hawk game, and in my humble opinion, was a hell of a way to go out. In a way, it feels like Neversoft's magnum opus. They took everything they learned from previous Tony Hawk games and brought those elements into a modern game that brings a narrative focus unlike anything else in the series. I think it's a damn shame that this game hasn't been released again. Meanwhile, over on the Xbox, you can still play Skate 3 online. I can imagine that a lot of people's first and only experience with this game were the last gen ports, and if that happened to be your experience, I can't recommend the PS3 and 360 games enough. Everyone talks about the timeless gameplay of the classics, the wild story in Underground, or the impressive world in American Wasteland. But nobody's talking about how Neversoft's most ambitious Tony Hawk game ended up being their last. RIP to Neversoft and the later vicarious visions that brought those classics back to life. Let's just hope that the next studio doesn't meet the same fate as the rest. If you have any opinions on Project 8, Proving Grounds, or any other Tony Hawk games that I should look into, let me know what you think. See you in the next one.
The East Coast scene is huge, and there's always pros around. Who knows who you'll run into?
Alright, Green Man, give me that wallet.